I am going to begin this one in the worst possible place, which is at the bottom of the Thames on a November night, because that is where it began for the man this story belongs to, and you ought to begin where he began, in the cold and the dark, and the absolute certainty that he was about to die. His name was Nicholas Warde, Earl of Westbrook, and he was 29 years old, and at the moment I am asking you to find him, he was sinking. He had gone into the river, off the stairs at Wapping, a little after midnight. He had not gone in willingly. I want that understood at once, because it matters, and because the truth of it is uglier than an accident, and is going to drive everything that follows. He had been walking back along the waterside from a meeting that had run late, alone, foolishly alone, and 3 men had come out of a passage between 2 warehouses, and there had been a knife, and a great deal of swearing, and a blow to the back of his skull that turned the world white, and then the cold black water of the Thames had closed over his head, and the men on the stairs had watched to be sure he did not come up, and had gone away satisfied that he would not. For they had not thrown a drunk into the river, those 3 men. They had been paid to remove an earl, by a person who stood to gain a great deal by the removing, and they had done their work the way such work is done at midnight on a tidal river, which is to say, thoroughly, and they had every reason to believe it finished. And it very nearly was. Because here is the thing about the Thames, and you must understand it to understand the whole of this story. The river is not water the way a lake is water. The river is a living, moving, tidal thing, fed twice a day by the sea, and at certain hours it runs out toward the ocean, with a pull that no swimmer in the world can fight. Cold enough in November to stop a strong man's heart inside of minutes. Black as tar and thick with the filth of the greatest city on earth. A man who goes into the Thames at midnight in November does not, as a general rule, come out again. The river keeps what it takes. Half the bodies it swallows are never found at all, and the watermen who work it have a dozen grim sayings about its appetite, and not one of them is a joke. The Earl of Westbrook went down into that black water, with his skull ringing, and his lungs already burning, and his fine heavy coat dragging him under like a hand around his ankle, and he understood, with the strange flat clarity that comes to drowning men, that this was the end of him. He thought, and he told me afterward that this was the whole of what he thought. In that last moment, which tells you something about the life he had been living, he thought, "No one even knows I am here." And then, out of the black water, a hand closed around his wrist. It was a small hand, a hard, cold, astonishingly strong small hand, and it closed around his wrist like an iron cuff, and it pulled, not up, which is what a drowning man's panic screams for, and what would have drowned them both, but sideways, across the current, at an angle that made no sense to him at all, and was, it turned out, the only angle in the whole river that could have saved his life. There was a voice in the dark, low and fierce, saying words he could not hear, over the roaring in his ears. There was the scrape of his body over something, a mooring chain, a sunken timber, he never knew, and then mud, blessed, solid, stinking river mud, under his hands, and the hand on his wrist, hauling, with a strength that seemed impossible for so small a thing, dragging 200 pounds of half-drowned Earl up out of the sucking water and onto the foreshore inch by furious inch. And the last thing Nicholas Warde saw, before the dark took him properly, was a face bending over his in the faint light off the water. A girl's face, fierce and frightened and streaked with river mud, with a pair of eyes the exact grey-green of the Thames itself, looking down into his, and the last thing he heard was that low, fierce voice saying, close to his ear, "Breathe, you great fool. Breathe. I didn't haul you out of my river just to watch you quit. And I am going to stop us right there, with the Earl of Westbrook face down in the Thames mud, and the mud-streaked girl bent over him, willing him to breathe, and neither of them yet aware that this filthy, freezing midnight on a London foreshore is the beginning of the only thing either of them will ever truly call a life. because before I take you one step further, you and I have business. Find the subscribe button, press it. It costs you nothing, and it takes a moment, and it means that the next story I sit down to tell finds its way to you the moment I have it ready, and there is always a next, and it is always worth your while. And if you will not subscribe, well, then you owe me one, and I will tell you plainly that I am very patient about my debts, and I never, ever forget who owes me what. Now, settle in and pull your chair a little nearer the fire, because the rest of this is going to be cold for a while before it is warm. I am going to take you back, not far, to who these two people were before the river threw them together. And then I am going to tell you the strangest part, which is not that a Mudlark girl pulled an Earl out of the Thames. It is that the Earl spent the next 12-month of his life looking for her, and that she spent the same 12-month making very sure he did not succeed. Let me tell you what a Mudlark is, because most of you have never met one, and the world has mostly chosen to forget they existed. And the girl who saved the Earl of Westbrook was one, and you cannot understand her until you understand it. When the tide goes out on the Thames, twice a day, every day, hauling back toward the sea and laying bare the great stinking grey foreshore that the water had covered, the mud is left behind, and in the mud is everything the river and the city have dropped or thrown or lost. Lumps of coal fallen from the colliers, lengths of rope, copper nails worked loose from the hulls of ships, bits of iron, scraps of canvas, the odd dropped coin, the odder dropped ring. None of it worth anything to anyone with money. All of it worth something, a farthing here and a halfpenny there, to the people who had nothing. And so, at every low tide, in every weather, the poorest of London's poor went down onto the foreshore in their bare feet and their rags, and bent their backs to the mud, scavenging the river's leavings to sell, a long cold day's filthy labour for the price of a loaf. They were called Mudlarks. Most of them were children. Many of them were old women. And the river took its toll of them too. The cold, the filth fevers, the tides that came back faster than a tired body could climb, the rotten timbers and the broken glass, and the things in the mud that festered in a cut foot. It was the lowest work in the whole city, the work you did when there was no other work left to do, and the people who did it were invisible, even to the invisible poor. A respectable beggar looked down on a Mudlark. That is how low it was. And the girl who pulled the Earl of Westbrook out of the black water was, on that November night, 20 years old, and had been working that foreshore since she was 6. Her name was Kit Sparrow, though no one had called her Catherine since her mother died, and to the whole of the riverside she was simply Kit. Kit Sparrow, and yes, I know, the name is almost too apt. A small, scrappy river bird that lives where nothing else will and survives what nothing else could. And I promise you, I did not invent it. Some people are simply born with the right name, and Kit was one of them. She had not always been a Mudlark. That is the thing I want you to hold on to, because it is the key to her. And the river world knew it and respected her a little for it, even at the bottom of everything. Kit Sparrow was a waterman's daughter. Her father, Tom Sparrow, had been a Thames waterman, one of the licensed boatmen who rowed Londoners up and down and across the river before the bridges multiplied. A hard trade, and a proud one, and Tom had been good at it, and he had loved his daughter, and he had taught her the river the way a man teaches the thing he loves best in the world. He had taught her to read the water, the set of the tides, the run of the currents, the places where the river was deep and the places where it shelved, the way the surface lied about what was underneath, and how to read the truth beneath the lie. By the time Kit was 9, she could read the Thames better than men 3 times her age. It was, her father said, a gift. It was, as it turned out, the gift that was going to save an Earl's life 11 years later. But the river that gives, takes. When Kit was 10, her father drowned, caught in a squall off Limehouse, his wherry swamped, gone under in the very water he had spent his life mastering. And Kit's mother followed him inside 2 years, of grief, and a fever, and the slow killing weight of poverty. And Kit Sparrow at 12 was alone in the world, with nothing but a waterman's daughter's knowledge of a river that had eaten both her parents. And so she did the only thing left. She went down onto the foreshore, into the mud, and she made the river that had killed her family keep her alive. She read its tides and worked its leavings, and she was better at it than anyone, because she understood the water as no other mudlark did, and she survived. Fiercely, stubbornly, alone, on the absolute bottom of the world, for 8 long years, and she expected nothing else of her life, and she had made her peace with expecting nothing, which is the hardest peace there is to make, and the easiest to mistake for contentment. That is who was working the foreshore at Wapping at midnight on a November night in 1818, by the light of a stub of candle in a horn lantern, scavenging the low tide, because a low tide at midnight meant less competition for the coal, and who saw, out in the black water where no swimmer should have been, a dark shape go under, and heard the splash and the shouting on the stairs, and saw 3 men hurry away, and understood in one instant, with her river-reading eyes, exactly what she was looking at, and exactly what would happen to the man in the water, and exactly the one angle across the current by which he might, just possibly, be reached. And Kit Sparrow, who owed the world precisely nothing, and the gentry less than nothing, and who knew better than any living soul what the river did to people who went into it, Kit Sparrow put down her lantern and waded into the freezing black Thames at midnight after a stranger, because that was the kind of person she was underneath the 8 hard years, and because, as she said to him in the mud, she was not going to stand on her own foreshore and watch the river take one more soul if she could help it. She got him out. We have seen that she got him out. And then she knelt over him in the mud and pounded the water out of his lungs until he heaved and choked and breathed, and she got her own shawl off her shoulders, her only shawl, in November, mind, the one warm thing she owned, and wrapped it round him, and she shouted up the stairs for the watch until she heard them coming. And then Kit Sparrow did the thing that turns this from a rescue into a story. She ran. Now you are going to ask me why. Why a girl who had just risked her own life to save a stranger's would vanish before he could so much as learn her name, and it is the right question, and the answer is the whole of who she was, so let me give it to you properly. She ran, first, from simple, hard sense, the kind that poverty teaches early. Think on it. A mudlark girl, in rags, alone on the foreshore at midnight, found kneeling over a half-drowned gentleman with his purse gone and his head broken, for the men who threw him in had taken his purse, to make it look like a robbery. What do you imagine the watch would have made of that scene? What would a magistrate have made of it? Not here is the heroine who saved his lordship's life. No, here is the riverside thief who robbed and drowned a gentleman and was caught in the act. Kit Sparrow knew exactly how that story would be told, and exactly who would hang for it, and it would not be the 3 men hurrying away up the passage. So she ran, because to stay was to put her own neck in the noose, and she had not survived 8 years on the foreshore by being a fool about the law. But there was a second reason, and it is the deeper one, and it is the one that makes her worth a whole story. She ran because she knew, the way she knew the tides, that nothing good could come of a mudlark and an Earl. She had seen his coat, even soaked and ruined. She knew quality when the river coughed it up. She had been pulling the leavings of the rich out of the mud her whole life. She knew that he was a great man, and she was a nothing, and she knew exactly the shape of every story in which a great man takes notice of a poor girl who has done him a service, and not one of those stories ended well for the girl. He might reward her, if he were kind, toss her a few coins, the price of a life, and feel himself generous. He might take a fancy to her, if he were the other kind, and she knew what became of poor girls a gentleman took a fancy to. Either way, she would be a thing that had happened to him, a good deed he had received, or a convenience he had used, and either way, she would be left exactly where she had always been, only now, with the added cruelty of having been, for one night, close enough to a different life to see how far away it was. Kit Sparrow had made her peace with expecting nothing, and the single most dangerous thing in the world, to a person who has made that particular peace, is hope. Hope was the one luxury she could not afford, because she had seen what it did to people on the foreshore, the ones who let themselves want a way out, and broke on the wanting. So she wrapped her only shawl around a stranger, and she saved his life, because she could not do otherwise, and then she ran from him before he could become a hope, back into the dark and the mud and the river world, where she knew exactly what to expect, which was nothing, which was safe. She did not know, she could not have known, that she had just saved the life of the one man in London who was constitutionally incapable of letting a debt like that go unpaid. She thought she would never see him again. She rather hoped she wouldn't. She was wrong about that, as it happens, but it took him a year. Let me tell you about the Earl now, about who he was before the river, so that you can measure, by the end, how far the river moved him. Nicholas Warde, Earl of Westbrook, was not a bad man. I want to say that plainly, because the men in this kind of story are so often bad men in want of reforming, and Nicholas was not that. He was something more ordinary and, in its way, sadder. He was a man who had never once in his life been asked to be anything other than what he was born, and had therefore never become anything at all. He had inherited young, and well, and easily. The title, the estates, the great house in Grosvenor Square, the seat in the Lords, the whole vast, comfortable apparatus of an English earldom had descended on him at 21, and had asked nothing of him in return, but that he occupy it, and he had occupied it, competently and without complaint, for 8 years. He was not cruel, he was not a wastrel. He attended to his estates and his duties. He was civil to his tenants, and generous to his servants, and pleasant to his peers. And he was, underneath all of it, profoundly and invisibly alone, not in the dramatic way of a man with a wound, but in the quiet, ordinary way of a man who has never been needed by anyone for anything, and has therefore never found out what he is for. He had grown up motherless, and was now fatherless. He had no brothers, no sisters. His nearest relation was a cousin, of whom more shortly, and none of it good. He had acquaintances by the 100 and friends by the none, because friendship requires that two people need something from each other that is not money or advantage, and Nicholas had never in his life met anyone who needed anything from him but money or advantage. He went to his clubs, he went to the balls, he was considered an excellent match and pursued accordingly, which had taught him by 29 to assume that every smile turned his way was aimed at his title, and he was mostly right, and the rightness had made him quietly, terminally tired. That was the man who went into the Thames at midnight, a man of whom, in his own last conscious thought, it could be said with perfect truth, "No one even knows I am here." A man worth a great deal to a great many people, and worth, as a person, to anyone living, almost nothing at all. And then a girl who had never heard his name, who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, who did not know he was an earl, and would not have cared if she had. A girl waded into a freezing black river at midnight, and pulled him out of it for no reason in the world, but that she could not stand to let him drown. Do you see what that did to him? Do you see what it had to do to a man like that? He woke 3 days later in his own bed in Grosvenor Square, with a broken head and a raging fever, and his physician grave at the bedside, and the first thing he was aware of, before he knew where he was, before he knew his own name, was a fierce, low voice in the dark saying, "Breathe, you great fool. I didn't haul you out of my river just to watch you quit." And the second thing he was aware of, clutched in his hand, where his fevered fingers had apparently refused for 3 days to let the servants take it from him, was a shawl, a coarse, worn, river-stained woolen shawl, mended at one corner with thread of a different color, smelling of mud and tar, and, very faintly, underneath, of wood smoke and a particular cheap lavender soap. A girl's shawl. Her shawl. The one warm thing she owned, given to a freezing stranger and left behind. Nicholas Warde lay in his great bed, in his great empty house, and held that shawl, and he wept, which he had not done since he was a child, and which he could not afterward fully explain, except that for the first time in his adult life, someone had needed nothing from him and had given him everything, had given him his actual life, asking nothing, leaving nothing but a worn shawl and a fierce voice in the dark, and had vanished before he could so much as say her name. And somewhere in that fever, somewhere in those tears, the tired, empty Earl of Westbrook conceived the single purpose that was going to remake his entire life. He was going to find her. He went about it, at first, entirely wrong, and I want to tell you how wrong, because his failure is the most important thing that happened to him, more important than any success, for it was the failing that taught him. He did it like an earl. Of course he did. It was all he knew how to be. The moment he could sit up, he set his people to it, his secretary, his steward, a pair of Bow Street runners engaged at considerable expense. He gave them what he had, a girl, young, river mud on her face, eyes the grey-green of the Thames, a low, fierce voice, somewhere on the foreshore near Wapping stairs on such a night, and a shawl, mended at the corner. "Find her," he said. "Spare no expense. There will be a great reward, for her, and for whoever leads me to her." And nothing happened. Nothing at all. It baffled him. He had money. Money found things. Money had always found things. But money, it turned out, could not find Kit Sparrow. And the reason it could not is the reason this part of the story matters so much. Because the moment a gentleman's agents began moving through the riverside asking after a young Mudlark girl who had been near Wapping stairs, the night an earl was robbed and nearly drowned, offering money, mind, a great reward, the entire riverside closed over the question like the tide over a sandbank. You will understand why, if you put yourself in the river world's place. A rich man's men, asking after a poor girl, in connection with a gentleman robbed and left for dead. What does that look like, from the bottom? It looks like a hunt. It looks like a girl being sought to hang for a crime. The reward made it worse, not better. For everyone on the foreshore knew that a reward offered by the rich for the poor was a reward for a body to blame, and not one of them would give up one of their own to that. Not for any money, because tomorrow it might be them. The river world had exactly one defense against the world above it, and that defense was silence, and they closed it around Kit Sparrow without her ever knowing they did it, and the Earl's agents came back, week after week, with nothing. It took Nicholas Warde the better part of 2 months to understand why he was failing, and the understanding, when it came, was the first crack in the shell of the man he had been. He understood, finally, that he was looking for her the way he did everything, from above, at a distance, with money, expecting the world to deliver up what he wanted, because it always had, and that this was the one thing in the world that could not be bought, because the people who knew where she was had nothing but their silence, and would not sell it to the likes of him, and were right not to. If he wanted to find her, he was going to have to go down to where she was, himself, on foot, as a man, not as an earl. He was going to have to earn the trust of a world that had every reason to distrust him, and he was going to have to do it slowly, and honestly, and at the cost of everything that had made him comfortable. So he did. It took him a year, and the year is the heart of this story, and I am not going to rush it, because it is where the man was made. He began to go down to the river himself, not in his fine clothes. He learned quickly that the coat was a wall, but plainly dressed, alone, on foot, day after day, down to the foreshore, and the waterside lanes, and the riverside taverns, and the markets where the mudlarks sold their pickings. And at first, he was met exactly as you would expect, with suspicion, with closed faces, with the flat, hostile silence, the poor keep for the rich who come slumming. He was a gentleman, playing at the riverside. Everyone could see it, and no one told him anything. But here is what Nicholas Warde discovered in that first hard month of being told nothing, and it surprised him more than anything had ever surprised him. He found that he liked it down there. Not the poverty. He was not a fool, and he never once romanticized the poverty. He saw the cold and the hunger and the river's cruelty plainly, and it horrified him. But the people. The river world was the first place in his entire life where no one wanted anything from him, because no one knew who he was, and so for the first time he met people as people. The watermen with their salt humor, the old women who worked the mud with their endless terrible stories, the children, the dock hands, the whole teeming, surviving riverside, none of whom smiled at his title, because none of them knew he had one, and he found, to his astonishment, that without his title he was rather better company than he had ever been allowed to be with it. He stopped, somewhere in that year, asking after Kit at all. Or rather, he never stopped, but he stopped making it the point. He began, instead, simply to be there, to learn the river the way she had learned it, though he never knew it was her gift he was chasing. He learned the tides, he learned the trades. He spent a whole month with a waterman named Old Pell, who took the strange, persistent gentleman under his wing for reasons Pell never explained, and taught him to read the water, and Nicholas, who had crossed the Thames 1,000 times on bridges without once thinking about what ran beneath them, came to understand the living river that had nearly killed him and had, through the hands of a girl who could read it, given him back his life. And as the months turned, the riverside began, slowly, to thaw toward him. The poor watched the rich far more closely than the rich ever imagine, and what they watched was a gentleman who kept coming back, who learned their names and remembered them, who did not preach and did not pity and did not, ever, stop being kind. Word went round, the way it does, that the Westbrook gentleman was all right, that he had paid for old Mrs. Tilly's grandson to see a real doctor, that he had quietly settled the debt that was going to put the Hanways out onto the street, that he had stood around at the prospect for a whole crew of half-drowned colliers and asked nothing for it. The river world began, grudgingly, to claim him a little. And a man the river world has claimed a little is a man it will eventually talk to. But here is the thing. Here is the ache at the center of that year. The more they thawed, the more they talked. The closer he came, the more Kit Sparrow drew away. For she knew he was looking. Of course she knew. The riverside knew everything. And the moment the gentleman who'd been pulled from the water started haunting the foreshore, every soul on it understood who he was looking for, and a good few of them put it together that it was Kit. And they did not give her up. They never gave her up. The silence held, even as the man earned their liking, which tells you something true and lovely about that hard world. But they could not stop her hearing of it. She heard he was searching. She heard he was kind. She heard, God help her, that he carried a worn shawl in his coat and had asked old Pell, once, very quietly, whether he knew a Mudlark girl who read the river like a waterman, and that when Pell said he did not, the gentleman had looked, for a moment, like a man who had lost something. And every word of it was a hand reaching for the one thing Kit Sparrow could not afford. So she ran from it, the way she had run from him on the foreshore. She changed the stretch of river she worked. She kept her head down. She made herself scarce and silent, because she was more frightened of that worn shawl in his coat than she had ever been of the river, or the cold, or the law. She had built her whole survival on wanting nothing, and here was a kind man with her shawl in his coat, threatening to make her want everything, and she knew, that if she let herself be found, and it ended the way such things always ended, it would break the one thing in her that the river had never managed to break, which was her ability to bear her life. She loved him a little by the end of that year, I think, though she would have died before saying so, and loved him for exactly the things she had heard. The kindness, the persistence, the shawl, and that was precisely why she could not let him find her. Some people run toward the thing they want. Kit Sparrow had been taught, by a hard teacher, to run from it. It could not go on like that forever. Something had to break the deadlock. And what broke it, in the end, because this story has been waiting to close its circle since the first cold page, was the river and the three men, and a debt that had never been paid. I have been keeping something from you, and it is time you had it, because it is about to come due. The three men who threw the Earl of Westbrook into the Thames had been paid. I told you that at the start. And the person who paid them was the Earl's cousin and heir, a smiling, charming, comprehensively rotten gentleman named Mr. Julian Warde, who stood next in line to the earldom and all its wealth, and who had run through his own fortune at the gaming tables, and who had done the arithmetic that desperate men do, and concluded that the only thing standing between himself and salvation was a cousin who was inconsiderate enough to be alive. So Julian had arranged matters, discreetly, through intermediaries, the way these things are arranged, and then he had waited for the news of his cousin's tragic drowning, a robbery on the waterside, so dangerous, the river so cruel, and instead, the news that reached him was that the Earl of Westbrook had been pulled half dead from the Thames by some person unknown, and had survived. You can imagine how that sat with Mr. Julian Warde. You can imagine, too, how it sat with him over the following year, as his debts mounted and his cousin stubbornly went on living, and as a most unwelcome rumor began to reach him, that the Earl had spent that whole year combing the riverside, not only for the girl who saved him, but, quietly, for the men who had thrown him in. For Nicholas had not forgotten that part, a lesser obsession, beneath the great one, but real. He meant to know who had wanted him dead, and the riverside, which had begun to talk to him, was beginning, here and there, to let slip the kind of thing that talks. That the attack at Wapping had not been a chance robbery at all, but paid work, arranged work, and that the man who arranged it was a gentleman. Julian Warde understood that his cousin was, slowly, two threads at once, walking toward him, and he understood that the girl, whoever she was, this Mudlark who had pulled Nicholas from the water, was the one witness who had been there, who had seen the three men leave, who could tie the whole thing together. And so Mr. Julian Warde, who had already tried to murder one inconvenient person, decided to be thorough and put out word of his own along the riverside. Quiet word, the kind that travels in the dark, that there was money, good money, for anyone who could find a certain Mudlark girl, not to reward her, to silence her. And now we have two hunts running along the same dark river, the Earl's, made of kindness and a worn shawl, and the cousin's, made of fear and a fistful of coin, both of them reaching for the same girl, and the riverside, which had protected Kit Sparrow from both, beginning at last, under the weight of two hunts at once, to crack. It came to its head on a night in November. 1 year, near enough to the day, since the black water first closed over the Earl's head. She was working the foreshore at Wapping. She had gone back to it at last, her old stretch, the place she knew best, because a year had passed, and she had let herself believe the danger of him was over, that the gentleman had surely given up, that she was safe again to work the river that was the only home she had. She was wrong about the danger being over. She was only wrong about which danger. They came for her the way they had come for him, out of the dark, between the warehouses, 3 men, though not the same 3. She heard them too late. She was quick, and she knew the foreshore in the dark better than any living soul, and she ran, down across the mud toward the water where she was surest of her footing. But the tide was wrong, and they had her cut off from the stairs, and they drove her down toward the Black River exactly as they had been paid to do, because a Mudlark girl drowned at the low tide is no one's mystery and no one's grief, and Mr. Julian Warde had been very clear about what was wanted. And Kit Sparrow, at the edge of the water that had taken her father and her livelihood and very nearly her own life 100 times over, with 3 men closing in and nowhere left to run, did the only thing she had left to do. She did what she had done a year before. She went into the river. But this time it was her own life she was trying to save, and this time there was no one on the foreshore to read the water for her, and the November Thames at the turn of the tide is no kinder to a waterman's daughter than to an earl. She knew the angle. She knew the current. She was the best reader of that river alive, and even so, in the dark, in the cold, with the panic on her and her strength going, she was losing, the water dragging her out and down exactly as it had dragged him, and Kit Sparrow, who had never in her life had anyone to call for, went under the black water, thinking the thought she had spent 20 years earning the right to think, which was, "No one even knows I am here." And a hand closed around her wrist. A man's hand this time, large and strong and certain, reaching down into the black water and closing around her wrist like an iron cuff, and pulling, not up, but sideways, across the current, at the one angle in the whole river that could reach her, because the man on the other end of that hand had spent a year learning to read the Thames from an old waterman named Pell, and had come down to the foreshore that night, as he came most nights now, and had seen 3 men driving a girl toward the water, and had understood, with a year's hard-won river knowledge, exactly what he was looking at, and exactly the one angle by which she might, just possibly, be reached. Nicholas Warde hauled Kit Sparrow out of the Thames the way she had hauled him, inch by furious inch, up out of the sucking black water and onto the foreshore, into the mud. And he knelt over her and pounded the river out of her lungs until she heaved and choked and breathed. And the 3 men, who had not been paid enough to murder a girl in front of a witness who was plainly a gentleman and plainly enraged, melted away into the dark and were gone. And Kit Sparrow lay in the river mud, breathing, soaked and frozen and alive, and looked up into the face of the man bending over her, and even in the dark, even after a year, she knew him. Of course she knew him. She had been running from him for 12 months. And the Earl of Westbrook looked down into a pair of eyes the exact grey-green of the Thames, in a face streaked with river mud. And he knew her too. He had been looking for her for a year. He had her shawl in his coat at that very moment, as he had carried it every day for a year, and he could feel it against his chest as he knelt over her in the mud, and he found that he could not, for a moment, speak at all. It was Kit who spoke first. Of course it was. She coughed up half the Thames, and she looked up at the man who had just hauled her out of her own river, and what she said, and I love her for it. I have loved her for it from the moment I first told this story. What Kit Sparrow said, lying in the freezing mud with her life just handed back to her, was, "Took you a year, then." And the Earl of Westbrook, kneeling over her, soaked and shaking, and a year's worth of looking finally over, put back his head and laughed. Laughed in a way he had not laughed since he was a boy, the helpless, astonished laughter of a man whose whole long search has ended in the mud with an insult. And he said, "You have no idea. You hid extraordinarily well." "I'm a mudlark," said Kit. "Hiding's the trade." She was shaking too hard now to say more, the cold taking her, and he got his own coat off and around her, his good coat, and she felt the lump in it, and knew before she touched it what it was, her own shawl, carried a year against a stranger's heart, and he got her up, and got her to the stairs, and that, my dears, was the end of the running, for both of them, for good. He did not sweep her up and carry her off to be a countess. I want you to know that, because it would be the easy ending, and these two had not earned the easy ending, and would not have wanted it. He took her somewhere warm and dry, to the house of old Pell and his wife, who asked no questions and gave up their own fire, and when she was warm and fed and herself again, the two of them had the conversation that a year had been building toward, and it was the hardest conversation either of them had ever had, and it is the true climax of this story, more than the river, more than the cousin, because it is where two proud, frightened people had at last to decide whether to hope. "You've been looking for me a year," Kit said. "Why?" "To thank you. At first." He turned the worn shawl over in his hands. "You saved my life and vanished. And I owed you a debt I couldn't pay if I couldn't find you, and I do not leave debts unpaid. There's your answer then. You've found me. Pay it, and we're square." She lifted her chin, and there was the old fierce river-bird in her, the girl who had made her peace with nothing. "Name your figure, my lord. What's a gentleman's life worth this season? Toss me my reward, and we'll both get on with being what we are." And Nicholas Warde looked at her, at the pride of her, the fierce, frightened pride that was nearly all she had, the same pride that had made her run from him for a year rather than let herself hope, and he understood it, because the year on the river had taught him to understand it, and he did not flinch from it, and he did not insult her with money. He set the shawl down between them. "I could do that," he said quietly. "I could pay you, and we could be square, and you could go back to the mud, and I could go back to the house in Grosvenor Square, where no one knows I'm alive, and we would both be exactly what we were a year ago. And I will, Kit, if that is what you want, because I owe you your own choosing, and I'll not take it from you. But I am going to tell you the truth first, and then you may choose." He was quiet a moment. Old Pell's fire ticked in the grate. "A year ago you pulled a dead man out of the river," he said. "Not just from the water. From the whole of a life in which no living soul needed me for anything but my money, and no one would have wept at my funeral but my tailor, who'd have lost a good customer. I went into that river a man who had never once been wanted as himself, by anyone, and a girl who didn't know my name and had nothing to gain waded into the cold after me for no reason in the world but that she couldn't watch me drown. Do you know what that does to a man like I was? You didn't save my life that night, Kit. You showed me I'd never had one, and then you vanished, and I have spent a year on this river looking for you, and somewhere in the looking, I stopped being the man who went into the water and became, I don't entirely know what I became, someone better, someone the river made, you made, without ever being there." "That's the shawl talking," said Kit, but her voice had gone unsteady. "That's gratitude. It passes, and it is not gratitude, though it started as gratitude. Gratitude doesn't make a man learn to read the tides. Gratitude doesn't make him glad. Glad, Kit, to spend a year being told nothing by suspicious watermen on a cold foreshore. I was happier this last year, looking for you and never finding you, than I was in 29 years of having everything. That is not gratitude. I have had a great deal of time to be sure of the difference." He looked at her, and there was nothing of the Earl in his face at all, only the man. "I love you, Kit Sparrow. I have loved you since before I knew your name, since a fierce voice in the dark told me to breathe, you great fool, and I have spent a year learning to be the kind of man who might one day deserve to say so to your face. And now I have, and you may toss it back at me, and I'll pay my debt and let you go, because I'll not cage a river bird. But you wanted the truth, and that is the truth, the whole of it." And Kit Sparrow sat by old Pell's fire, with the worn shawl between them, and the great impossible hope she had run from for a year, finally, inescapably, in the room. And she was so frightened of it that for a long moment she could not speak at all. "I ran from you," she said at last, very low, "because I knew how it ends. The Mudlark and the great man. I've heard that song. It ends with the girl worse off than she started, having seen what she can't have. I made my peace with wanting nothing, a long time ago, my lord. It's how I've stayed alive. And you and your shawl and your year of looking, you're asking me to want everything. And if I let myself, and it goes the way it always goes, it'll kill me. Not the river, the wanting. The wanting'll kill me where the river never could. Then I'll spend my life proving it doesn't go that way," said Nicholas. "Not as your rescuer. God knows you don't need rescuing. You've pulled 2 people out of that river now, and I've only managed the one. Not as your benefactor, as your equal, Kit, because that is what you are. You read that river better than any man alive, and you have more courage in your cold hands than the whole House of Lords, and I would no more condescend to you than to the sea. I'm not offering to lift you out of the mud. I'm asking you to come and read the river with me, for the rest of our lives, and quarrel with me, and tell me when I'm a great fool, which I will frequently be. A breath. Marry me, not because you need me, because I have been drowning my whole life, and you are the only person who ever reached into the dark and pulled me out, and I find I would rather not go back under. And Kit Sparrow, 20 years old, waterman's daughter, who had made her peace with nothing and had it shattered by a man with her own shawl in his coat, looked at him for a long, long moment. And then she did the bravest thing she had ever done, and she had done some very brave things, the bravest of which I have already shown you, in the black water at midnight. She let herself hope. "You're going to be terrible at the river," she said unsteadily. "A year with old Pell and you still can't read a turning tide to save your life. You'd have drowned tonight too, if I hadn't already done all the dangerous bits a year ago and worn the water out." "Almost certainly," Nicholas agreed. "I'll need teaching. For years, probably. Decades." "Decades," said Kit Sparrow, and her fierce riverbird face cracked, at last, into something she had not let it do in a very long time, which was to hope out loud. "That's a long lesson, my lord." "Nicholas," he said. "That's a long lesson, Nicholas," and she picked up the worn shawl from between them, her own shawl, carried a year against his heart, and she looked at it, and then she put it round her own shoulders again where it belonged, and she said, "Yes." And that, my dear listeners, is where I leave them, by an old waterman's fire on a cold November night, a drowned Earl and a Mudlark girl who had each pulled the other out of the same black river a year apart, finding out at last that the rescue had never been one-sided, that it had taken both of them all along, each hauling the other out of a different kind of drowning. The cousin, Mr. Julian Warde, I will deal with quickly, because he does not deserve much of your evening. The 3 men he sent for Kit had seen the gentleman who pulled her from the water, and frightened men talk, and the Earl had spent a year, you'll remember, learning the riverside secrets, and between what the riverside knew and what the frightened men confessed, the whole of it came out, the paid attack, the gentleman who arranged it, the second hunt in the dark. Julian Warde did not hang in the end. The family arranged matters more quietly than that, as great families do. But he was sent abroad to a place very far from England and very far from money, and he troubled no one ever again. And that is more justice than men like him usually meet, and less than they deserve, which is the way of the world. And the Earl and the Mudlark were married, quietly, in a small church by the river, with old Pell to give the bride away, and half the foreshore crowded in at the back in their Sunday rags, because the river world had decided that Kit Sparrow was one of their own, and her wedding was their wedding, and it scandalized the whole of Mayfair, exactly as Kit had always known it would, and neither of them cared one farthing for the scandal. She became, in time, the Countess of Westbrook, and she never once pretended to be anything she wasn't, and she had a particular and lifelong tenderness for the riverside poor that emptied a good deal of the Westbrook fortune into the Mudlarks and the watermen's widows and the foreshore children, and the Earl never once begrudged a penny of it, for he knew exactly what he had been bought out of the river with, and what it was worth, and that no fortune on earth could match it. They say, and I believe it, that to the end of their days the Earl and Countess of Westbrook would walk down to the Thames together at the low tide, and stand on the foreshore where she had pulled him from the water, and read the river side by side, and that she taught him, over many patient years, to read it nearly as well as she could, and that he never, ever caught up to her, and never minded, and that the worn shawl mended at one corner was kept, always, folded in a place of honor, the most precious thing in a house full of treasures, because it was the one warm thing a girl who had nothing had given to a stranger who had everything and was drowning, and it had pulled them both, in the end, all the way home. You have sat by my fire through a cold year on a cold river, and I will not pretend I could have told it without you at the other end of the line. If it has given you something tonight, a warmth, a wish, a small, fierce hope that somewhere in your own dark a hand might yet reach down and pull you up, then I would ask you, before you go, to subscribe to Moonlight at Mayfair, for there are a great many more of these, and every one has a heart like this one has a heart, and I should hate for you to miss a single one. It costs you nothing, and it means more to me than I can say from this side of the fire. And if you still will not, well, you know what I am going to say. You owe me one. You have owed me since a hand closed around an Earl's wrist in the black water. I am patient, and I never forget. Subscribe to Moonlight at Mayfair, and come back to me beneath the soft light of the evening star, where every love is hard won, and every ending is deserved. Good night. And if you ever walk by the river at the low tide, and you see the small figures bent over the mud, look twice. You never do know who is down there, or whose life they will turn out to have saved.